wild to think about. But when you look at global health policy, you'd assume everyone would, like, be on the same page, right? But you find these little surprises, like, you know how the World Health Organization has that big agreement, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the FCTC? Yeah, the one aimed at cutting down tobacco use worldwide. Well, guess what? It actually includes harm reduction as a core strategy, like right there in the document. It makes you wonder about all those debates around vaping and stuff.
Yeah, and that idea of harm reduction within the FCTC, that's actually a perfect jumping off point for our deep dive today. We're looking at a book, In Chiwan, UTCM, In Yohu, Yun, Ishifang, In Shiwan, In Shifang, Ishifang, Du Kam Ovumtum, Sanpia Sev, Bun by Wang Yu-Yang, and for anyone out there, like you, who really wants to understand how Taiwan's handling tobacco control, this book offers a very specific and passionate perspective on the whole thing.
Totally. So all those questions you have, like about the history of tobacco harm reduction in Taiwan, the ups and downs, all that, we could dig deep into that.
Right.
In this deep dive, we're on a mission to understand the arguments for harm reduction as Wang Yu-Yang lays them out. We'll trace the entire journey of e-cigarettes in Taiwan, like from their first appearance to where things stand now. Plus, we'll explore the hurdles faced by advocates pushing for this alternative approach. We're especially keen on unpacking the recommendations the book puts forward and the emphasis it places on those forwards.
And to fully grasp this, it's crucial to understand the source. We're dealing with a book written by someone, deeply entrenched in advocating for legalizing e-cigarettes in Taiwan. It's personal, his arguments, his experiences. But importantly, it kicks off with forwards from various individuals, each offering their own take on this multifaceted issue. It's striking, really, how even these initial viewpoints expose some core tensions surrounding the topic.
Definitely. Let's jump right into those forwards then.
Right.
What strikes you right off the bat is this tension. You have this totally understandable desire for a smoke-free society, but it's up against this pragmatic realization that quitting just isn't a walk in the park for everyone, which then makes you ask, are there alternatives? And could those alternatives be less harmful?
Right.
This tension, you'll see, weaves its way throughout the entire discussion.
What's fascinating is the sheer range of voices they've got contributing right at the start. You have Su Han-chi, former Tainan County magistrate, who brings in his public health expertise and straight up mentions the WHO's harm reduction strategies. He argues that Taiwan needs to seriously consider what other countries are doing. Like, look at Sweden, he says. They've dramatically slashed smoking rates using snus, which is a smokeless tobacco product. And then there's the UK with their more open stance on e-cigarettes. His main point: balance the science with the politics. Don't let preconceived notions or, entrenched interests stand in the way of finding more effective ways to improve public health in Taiwan.
Yeah, he's basically saying we shouldn't let preconceptions or those with a vested interest stop us from finding better ways to improve public health here in Taiwan, right?
Exactly. Then there's Lo Cheng-sung, a professor at Southern Taiwan University of Science and Technology. He comes at it from a legal and social angle, and he raises some really pointed questions about smokers' rights. He makes this really interesting observation about the Taiwanese government's stance. On one hand, they slap huge taxes on tobacco and use that money to fund healthcare. But then on the other hand, they completely outlaw what some argue are less harmful alternatives, like e-cigarettes.
Right.
It's a bit of a head scratcher, right?
Yeah.
You're making money from something harmful to fund the consequences of that harm, but then you're rejecting options that could actually reduce that very harm you're making money from.
That's a good point. It does seem a little contradictory.
It is. And Professor Liu, he highlights that gap between the strict laws and what's happening in reality.
Right.
He points out that despite the bans, these products are still finding their way into the market. Like, where there's demand, supply will find a way.
Yeah.
He even touches on those unintended consequences, like how high taxes might actually create a black market for traditional cigarettes, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? His whole argument is for a more realistic approach to regulation, something that recognizes what's actually going on.
So a more grounded approach to lawmaking, one that takes into account what's actually happening and how enforceable things are, instead of aiming for an ideal that might not be achievable.
Exactly. Then we have Chuang Kai-jen, a professor from Taipei Medical University. He comes at it from a public health perspective that's, evolved over time. Initially, he was all for a completely smoke-free Taiwan, which, makes sense from a public health standpoint. But he acknowledges how ingrained smoking is and how tough it is for many people to completely kick the habit. What's insightful is how he recognizes the potential role of these newer generation products in reducing harm. He stresses the need for a science-based, rational approach, kind of echoing Professor Seuss' point about letting evidence lead the way. He even brings up Sweden's success with snus.
Right.
They're practically smoke-free, and it's because they embraced snus as a less harmful alternative. He highlights how different countries are trying different things, which underscores this whole debate between science, law, and deeply held beliefs about tobacco control.
So even someone whose initial focus was on getting everyone to stop smoking altogether now sees value in exploring these harm reduction strategies.
Yeah.
It really highlights the complex nature of all that.
Definitely. And then you've got Feng Kai-hung from Taipei Ocean University of Science and Technology. He brings this really personal and powerful perspective to the table, having battled addiction himself. He opens up about his struggles with nicotine and alcohol and voices his support for e-cigarettes and heated tobacco as harm reduction tools. He even cites findings from Public Health England and the FDA to back up his view. What's really interesting is how he uses Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory to frame Wang Yu-Yang's relentless advocacy work.
Okay.
This theory looks at how new ideas and technologies get adopted over time, and he uses it to explain why advocating for harm reduction can be such an uphill battle. He admires Wang's dedication, especially when faced with so much resistance.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Seeing this push for harm reduction as part of a bigger process of introducing a new idea, a new way of thinking, that challenges the way things have always been done.
Right. And then finally, we have Mifeng Yi, also from Southern Taiwan University of Science and Technology, who offers a more personal and academic take on Wang Yu-Yang's journey. She sees this book as a personal account of this struggle. She even compares Wang to Don Quixote, tilting at windmills, fighting against the odds. Her own work focuses on e-cigarette regulation, and she points out this gap between the ideal and the reality of advocating for e-cigarettes in Taiwan.
Right.
It's like the vision is great, but actually pushing for change, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So just from reading those forewords, it's clear that this isn't a simple issue with an easy answer.
Right.
Public health experts, legal minds, researchers, and those who've lived through addiction, they all offer unique and often interconnected perspectives.
Exactly.
It sets the stage for understanding the author's main arguments, particularly his emphasis on the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or the WHO FCTC, and that crucial concept of harm reduction within it.
Right.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little more. This book really puts a spotlight on the WHO FCTC. It mentions that Wang Yu-Yang himself got a special certification related to it, right?
Yeah, that's right. The book points out that in 2019, Wang Yu-Yang got a WHO FCTC certification specifically in smokeless tobacco.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and the book argues that this adds credibility to his whole argument about harm reduction. But even more importantly, the book hammers home his point right there in his self-introduction that the WHO FCTC explicitly names harm reduction as one of the key pillars of tobacco control, alongside reducing supply and demand. He even quotes the actual English definition from Article 1 Toy of the FCTC to back this up.
So his argument isn't that harm reduction is this radical idea, but that it's already a recognized strategy within this major international framework for tobacco control, which is the WHO FCTC.
Exactly. And this is where he really goes after the Taiwanese government, especially the Ministry of Health and Welfare and the Tobacco Hazards Prevention and Control Foundation. He says they've been consistently misinterpreting international data and evidence related to harm reduction, basically painting it as just a marketing ploy by the tobacco industry, which he claims is a distortion of the facts. The book really pushes for this tobacco harm reduction 2040 smoke-free Taiwan vision. It's advocating for policies that embrace less harmful options instead of sticking with traditional cigarettes.
That's a pretty serious accusation, though, to say they're misrepresenting those international guidelines to push a specific policy.
It is, but to back up his claim, he brings in examples from other countries, like the UK with their Swap to Stop program and their Vape Roll campaign. Then there's Sweden. They've got this incredibly low smoking rates because they embraced harm reduction strategies, especially with snus. He's essentially saying, look, it's working in other places. Why is Taiwan ignoring this?
So he's saying Taiwan's out of sync with this global shift towards harm reduction and tobacco control.
Exactly. And then, to really hammer it home, he brings in Derek Yak.
Oh, yeah. Derek Yak.
Former bigwig at the WHO, who was instrumental in developing the FCTC. Now, Yak is a huge advocate for harm reduction through the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World.
Right.
And get this, the book mentions that Dr. Yak even wrote a recommendation letter for this very book.
Wow.
That's a pretty significant connection to draw. It suggests that harm reduction isn't necessarily at odds with the aims of the FCTC as, envisioned by the WHO itself.
It does add a lot of weight to the arguments the author is making, considering how influential Derek Yak is in this field.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the specific history of e-cigarettes in Taiwan. How did they even show up and make their way into the country's regulations, or lack thereof?
Well, the book tells the story of the author's first encounter with an e-cigarette, and it's pretty memorable. It was in the Arctic, of all places, back in 2013.
Oh, wow.
He was on some work exchange program, and being a smoker, he was trying to figure out how to, have a cigarette in those freezing temperatures.
Right.
Then a colleague whips out an e-cigarette. The author describes the first puff as kind of nasty. Ugh.
But he saw the practicality of it, especially in that kind of extreme environment.
That's a pretty unusual and maybe not the most inspiring introduction to something that would become such a big part of his advocacy later on.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
So fast forward to 2017, the book goes into how he gets more involved. He's now focused on these emerging global trends in the exhibition industry, and e-cigarettes are booming with their own international trade shows. He sees this opportunity to be a representative for these e-cigarette expos in Taiwan.
So at this point, he's more interested in the potential for a new industry in Taiwan, right?
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. The book reveals that some big Taiwanese tech companies were involved in the e-cigarette scene. Or like in Foxconn, the company that makes iPhones, they were reportedly manufacturing the Sworn Air e-cigarette.
Really?
And Pegatron, another huge tech player with ties to Apple, was supposedly linked to JUL. The book suggests that news of this got hushed up. Wow, you wouldn't necessarily connect those tech giants with e-cigarettes. And the fact that it got swept under the rug suggests there was already some pushback or sensitivity around these products, even back then.
Exactly.
Wow.
Around the same time, the author starts experimenting with DIY e-liquids. He finds out that all the basic ingredients, vegetable glycerin, propylene glycol, flavorings, they're all readily available in Taiwan. The only thing missing? Nicotine. He even manages to make his own nicotine-free e-liquid.
Wow, that's interesting. So even before any official regulations came into play, there was this kind of DIY movement happening with these products.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But the turning point, the big one, according to the book, is October 2017. That's when the Taiwanese government dropped the bombshell. They're planning to ban e-cigarettes completely. This announcement is what really kicks off the author's full-time advocacy work. He sees this ban as a huge mistake and decides to dedicate himself to pushing for a different approach, one focused on regulation and harm reduction instead of just, an outright ban.
That's a big shift. He goes from someone involved in this potential industry to, like, a full-on advocate practically overnight, all because of this proposed ban.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Wow.
The book then outlines how the legislation unfolds. It mentions proposed changes to the Tobacco Hazards Prevention and Control Act, all aimed at completely banning e-cigarettes. This lays the groundwork for understanding all the challenges he and other advocates were going to face.
Yeah, which brings us to all those challenges faced by those pushing for this harm reduction approach in Taiwan. It sounds like it was a really rough road.
It really was. The book lays out all the obstacles they ran into in detail. One of the first hurdles the author talks about is his attempts to set up e-cigarette industry associations in Taiwan. He tried to create both the Taiwan E-Cigarette Commercial Guild and the Taiwan E-Cigarette Industry Development Association.
You'd think that forming industry groups would be, like, essential for any new industry trying to advocate for their interests, right?
Yeah.
What stopped them from doing that?
Well, the main roadblock was the government. The Ministry of Health and Welfare and the Ministry of Interior, they came out swinging, issuing warnings, and actively opposing these associations.
Oh, wow.
They basically shut them down before they could even gain any traction.
Mm-hmm.
Their argument was, well, there's no need for such groups because they're already planning to ban e-cigarettes.
So the government's stance, like, preemptively choked out any organized advocacy from within the industry itself.
Precisely.
Wow.
And then the book goes into the struggles they had with the Taiwanese media.
Yeah.
The author mentions instances where he felt the reporting was biased and even talks about a journalist who just brushed him off when he asked for a more balanced approach to the coverage. This pushed him to start writing op-eds to get his perspective out there.
Right.
Ironically, he mentions how the Tobacco Hazards Prevention and Control Foundation accused tobacco companies, and, those with vested interests, of using this very tactic of writing op-eds to manipulate public opinion.
So even trying to get their message across through the media was met with resistance and accusations of being in cahoots with the very industry they were trying to offer an alternative to.
Exactly. The book also details his efforts to connect directly with lawmakers. He reached out to people like Sheng Yunpeng and Chen Manli, hoping to find some allies who might be receptive to the whole idea of regulation and harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
But these attempts were largely unsuccessful, which he attributes to political pressure and disagreements between different government bodies.
It sounds like there was this huge bureaucratic inertia, and maybe politicians were just reluctant to go against the dominant narrative around e-cigarettes.
That's a good way to put it. And then on top of all that, he talks about his involvement in these international e-cigarette exhibitions in various countries.
Mm-hmm.
But even there, even on the international stage, Taiwanese advocates were hitting roadblocks. An expo in India got canceled out of the blue.
Oh, no.
Then, at an event in South Korea, they ran into problems because of pressure from China over Taiwan's participation.
Oh, wow.
And trying to get government subsidies to support these international efforts, forget about it. The Ministry of Health and Welfare shot that down, which even sparked an investigation by the Control Yuan, which is an oversight body in the Taiwanese government.
Wow.
That shows how closely the government was scrutinizing this whole issue.
It almost sounds like there was this deliberate effort to sideline and silence any attempt to legitimize or even have a balanced conversation about e-cigarettes, both within Taiwan and internationally.
Yeah, that's the image the book paints.
Yeah.
And to top it off, the author brings up those internal conflicts and the lack of a united front within the Taiwanese e-cigarette advocacy community itself. This eventually led him to leave the Taiwan E-Cigarette Industry Development Association.
Oh, wow.
It shows just how fragmented and difficult the whole landscape was for those trying to promote harm reduction.
Yeah. So it wasn't just opposition from outside. They were dealing with internal divisions as well, making it even harder to build a cohesive and effective movement.
Exactly. The book really drives home how many challenges individuals and groups faced when trying to advocate for a different approach to tobacco control in Taiwan, one that considers the potential of harm reduction through regulating e-cigarettes.
Okay, so zooming out and looking at the big picture, what are the main takeaways you get from this deep dive into the book?
What really jumps out is how consistent and passionate the argument for harm reduction is.
Mm-hmm.
It's rooted in those WHO FCTC principles and draws on those examples from other countries that have seen success with this approach. It meticulously traces the whole kind of messy history of e-cigarettes in Taiwan, from those early days when big tech was in the mix to where things are now with this almost total ban. And maybe most importantly, it vividly portrays the uphill battle faced by those who are pushing for alternative tobacco control policies against strong government opposition and a skeptical public. Plus, the focus on those forewords right at the beginning highlights the range of perspectives and those underlying tensions that are woven into this whole complex issue.
Right. For you, the listener, especially if you're fascinated by how policy gets made and how tough it is to advocate for change, this book is a really fascinating case study. It gives you those aha moments when you see the global context of harm reduction bumping up against Taiwan's current policies. It underscores the importance of considering different points of view and how international frameworks like the WHO FCTC can shape national health strategies.
Yeah, and that brings up a big question, something for you to think about. Given this global shift towards harm reduction and tobacco control, and the scientific arguments laid out in this book, and the endorsement from someone as influential as Derek Yock, and all the personal stories of advocacy we've talked about, what does Taiwan's strict ban on e-cigarettes really tell us about how they approach public health and individual choice?
It's a question worth pondering for sure. You could even ask, with the WHO itself recognizing harm reduction as a vital strategy, and with advocates like Wang Yu-Yang so passionately pushing for it in Taiwan, is the country missing a chance to really improve public health by dismissing this approach as laid out in this advocacy Bible? Certainly food for thought.